This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, Bob, are you ready for me to jump in?
Just a second.
Okay.
Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicole Hutchison of the Systems Engineering Research Center, SERC. SERC is a university-affiliated research center of the Department of Defense and leverages the research and expertise of faculty, staff, and student researchers from more than 20 collaborating universities throughout the United States. Today, Nicole will be presenting a summary of her work on the ATLAS project. The ATLAS project provides a general framework of what makes systems engineers effective. This webinar will explain the overarching ATLAS theory and its various components, and then Nicole will present findings that illustrate where and how healthcare systems engineers may differ from systems engineers in aerospace and defense, and how individuals can use this information to better understand their own abilities and map options for a future career. Dr. Hutchinson is a research engineer at SERC and currently is the Principal Investigator for the Helix project. Within INCOSE, Nicole serves as the editor for the Healthcare Annex of the Systems Engineering Body of Knowledge. Before joining SERC, Nicole spent 5 years working for Analytic Services, supporting the U.S. Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and Justice. She has helped plan and conduct exercises in emergency management, helped run the Louisiana Family Assistance Center following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and served 10 years in emergency medicine. She holds a PhD in systems engineering from Stevens Institute. So, Nicole, welcome to our webinar, and thank you for being willing to share with us the work you're doing leading the ATLAS project. If you'll give me just a minute, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then you can begin sharing yours.
Thanks very much for your introduction, Bob. I think I'm set up to share now, so if someone can just confirm when you can see my screen, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, yes, you've made the switch, and I can see your screen now.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit, as Bob said, about the project that we've been working on at Stevens for the last couple of years. So Helix is the overarching project, and it's a multi-year study which is really intended to help understand the systems engineering workforce. And it originally was meant to understand the workforce in the DoD, but we have expanded our initial findings from the DoD to understand how what we learned there applies in the defense industrial base and more broadly. What we're focused on is 3 research questions. What are the characteristics of systems engineers? And that initially was who were systems engineers. But what we found as we started doing this work was that organizations actually have a really hard time defining that for themselves consistently. So we changed that to what are the characteristics, and we'll talk some about that. What makes systems engineers effective and why? And then what can organizations do to improve the effectiveness of their systems engineers? So as I walk through the different results, where there are things that were a little bit unique to the healthcare systems engineers that we've talked to, I will highlight them. So far, most of the data has been collected through face-to-face interviews. They're anywhere from 90 minutes to 2.5 hours of interview time. We have 287 participants from 20 different organizations. And everything that we report is aggregated and anonymous. That was one of the conditions to protect not only the data itself, but to help our participants feel comfortable sharing their views more openly. So sometimes if you have a question that's too specific, I may not be able to answer it, but I'll do my best. So I want to be very upfront about what part of our data really focused on systems engineers in healthcare. And you can see here on the screen, healthcare was about 10% of our sample. And those folks were all people who were pretty focused on products, so systems engineers for medical devices, for example. We are working on starting a parallel study to get folks who are more operationally focused. We don't have that started yet, so I just wanted to be upfront and explain that whenever we're talking about healthcare systems engineers today, we're really talking about people who've worked on medical devices and do sort of the more traditional product systems engineering. Really quickly, terminology. The way we define systems engineering, we use the INCOSE definition. I'm not going to read it to you all. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with it. But we thought it was a good definition that covered all of the different things that systems engineers could do across the full life cycle of a system. And then a systems engineer is the person who does those things. And I want to just say that that doesn't necessarily mean that they have that title. In fact, 47% of our sample have never actually been titled as systems engineers. They might be general engineers or principal engineers or other things, but they're not titled as systems engineers. So what we had as criteria for people to be in the study was their organization said that they thought of them as a systems engineer, and that the individual themselves felt that they were a systems engineer. We also have a few other folks in the study who were peers, so managers, executive leadership, as well as direct peers, such as classic engineers and program managers who work with systems engineers who helped us to validate what we were hearing. And then just really quickly, because a lot of times we use, and you'll hear the terms Atlas and Helix used interchangeably, just so there's no misunderstanding, Helix is the overarching project, and Atlas is the primary product from that project. Really, they kind of mean the same thing, because right now Atlas is the only product that we have, but going forward that could change, so I just want to be clear about that. I mentioned earlier we used in-depth interviews. So we started with a grounded theory approach, which basically means we wanted to let the data speak for itself. Talked to, as I said, nearly 300 individuals and did in-depth interviews with them, and then used data mining techniques and qualitative analysis tools to discover what patterns we could from the data. And the graphs here are just a couple of example outputs on how, for example, on the top, different characteristics would be coded for within the data, and then we would compare different codings and see where there were high areas of overlap, and those were generally places where we would then start digging in a little deeper and finding out what the relationships were. So with that, what I'm going to do is jump into our primary results, and as I said, I'm going to try to highlight things that were a little bit different for healthcare systems engineers as I go. So what you're seeing here is, at the highest level, our framework for Atlas, which is, again, our theory of what makes systems engineers effective. So if you start with the individual systems engineer, the way we define effectiveness is an individual who consistently delivers value is effective. You might say, well, that could be true for any profession, and yes. What we're hoping is that this is a broad framework that's really helpful for understanding effectiveness for any engineering profession, but where you'll see the details being specific to systems engineering is kind of the next level down. So an individual who consistently delivers value is effective. You deliver value by working within an organization, and that organization is going to assign positions, which will include roles and responsibilities. And in order to perform in that position, you have to have a certain level of proficiency, and that's this kind of hexagon here in the middle. Proficiency is the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need, and again, that enables that consistent delivery of value. Within the context of an organization, you'll have characteristics about that organization, so they're not only selecting what position you'll be in, but there are things about the organization itself that might impact proficiency. Likewise, there are things about each individual person that might impact their proficiency as well. Here we have in the center the forces, and those are the things that we have identified that help people to improve their proficiencies over time. And I don't think any of them will be terribly surprising. First, and these are in order, first is experience, the second is mentoring, and the third is education and training. Again, not anything shocking there, but what's a little bit different about this is that we actually have 6,000 pages of transcripts where we can show why those are the right things and why that's the right order. And again, we'll talk about each one of these things in more detail. And then finally, each individual systems engineer and each systems engineering organization might create initiatives that are intended to bring those forces to bear and help more directly impact the proficiency of the systems engineer. So that's our overarching framework. And where we'll start next is we'll talk about what the value is. So we're saying you're only effective if you're consistently delivering value. What does that actually mean? So there were a lot of things in a lot of different organizations that came up. And what you're seeing here on the left are the values that we heard consistently. It didn't matter the domain. It didn't matter what types of systems they worked on. It didn't matter whether it was government or industry. These were the common values that were highly prized not only by the organization and by the folks that we talked to, like the peers and the managers and the executives, but that systems engineers said themselves they felt this was the primary value that they brought. The first one, again, translation of technical jargon into business or operational terms and vice versa. That's really being able to make sure that the business leaders understand the technical problems, and that sometimes when you're doing trade-off analysis, for example, if there's a business case for one option versus another, that you can communicate that effectively to your engineering team as well. I won't go through each one of these individually, but what I will say is that underneath each one, there is also a series of enabling values. So on the left are the primary values, and then there are several things that you can do to help bring that value about. And so when we're talking about a systems engineer being effective, what we're talking about is people who can do these types of things. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about are the roles and positions that an organization is going to assign. And again, in theory, it should be by performing those roles and performing in those positions that you would actually become effective. So these are the roles that we have identified for systems engineers. Let me talk really quickly about the difference between a role and a position. A position is whatever your job is as assigned. Think of that as your title and whatever HR would say you do. And then the roles are actually the systems engineering things you do. And what you're seeing here in the Venn diagram is there are systems engineering roles, and then there are things that systems engineers do, and hopefully there's a lot of overlap between those, but you may have things that you have to do as part of your job that are not necessarily systems engineering roles, and you'll see those in the red. An organizational functional manager, program project manager. They're related. Those are things that systems engineers commonly do, but they're not really systems engineering roles. What you see in the middle are the things that systems engineers are commonly doing, and we consider them systems engineering roles. And then the blue on the left, concept creator, is something that we're not seeing very much in the sample, but if you look towards the future of systems engineers and what systems engineers should be doing, for example, in INCOSE Vision 2025, if you look at what that says systems engineers should be able to do, concept creator, we believe, should be important going forward. We created this list starting with Sarah Sheard's 12 roles as systems engineers. We went through all of the resumes that we received, as well as all of the interview data to see what people were actually doing. We started with Sarah's framework, and then we added to it and updated it as we saw fit. So if you're familiar with Sarah's 12 roles, I think some of this will look very familiar. Things that we've added include things like systems engineering evangelist, which we can talk a little bit about later. That's really making the case for systems engineering, making the business case, helping other engineers understand why that approach makes sense. Sorry, I'm used to taking questions during, so it's very odd for me to talk this long without having a question. So I just wanted to point out that we've organized these into 3 different areas of focus So there are things you do that focus on the system that you're designing, that focus on the teams that are building those systems, and that focus on the process in the organization, sort of that overstructure for systems engineering. And all of those are important. And in our work, we consider all of these systems engineering. And I would say that all of them applied in the folks that we talked to in the healthcare industry as well. Okay, so we've talked about what value systems engineers provide. We've talked about how the positions and roles are performed to help you provide that value. The next thing we'll talk about is the proficiency of systems engineers. We specifically use the term proficiency instead of competency because when we early on started, we realized that as soon as we said competency, folks had their kind of favorite competency model already in mind. And it just sort of hamstrung the conversation. And so we did look at many different competency models. They did inform the work. But again, what we've created is based on letting the data so this is how we display our competency framework. We'll walk through what each one of these things means in a second. We have 6 proficiency areas, and underneath that there are categories and topics as appropriate. Starting at the top, math, science, and general engineering, that's the foundation that everything you do is going to be built on. Going clockwise, systems, domain, and operational context is exactly what it says. Do you understand the CONOPS? Do you understand the business context in which your system is operating? Do you understand the operational environment? Do you understand the technologies, the different engineering disciplines that are critical to making that system work? Systems engineering discipline is really what I would think of as analogous to what you'd find in the Systems Engineering Handbook. It's 15288, what are the appropriate processes? What is it that's unique to the discipline that you need to understand? So going through the life cycle, understanding systems management processes, et cetera. Continuing around, systems engineering mindset includes things like big picture thinking, but it also includes what we've termed paradoxical mindset, and that is not only having big picture thinking, but detail level thinking and being able to really make the judgment call on when you need to focus on one versus the other. It also includes things like having a flexible approach, being able to deal with uncertainty. We consider that the systems engineering mindset. So it's really about how you think about the systems that you work on. Interpersonal skills, anyone who knows Bill Miller will have heard him say that systems engineering is a contact sport, and that's really what this is all about. How do you work in a team? How do you communicate? We talked within the values about how that communication role can be really important. And then finally, technical leadership. So not just can you function well on a team, but can you lead a team? Can you build a team? And can you provide, even outside of an individual team, a more strategic direction about systems for the organization? So those are the major areas. What I'll do now is I'll kind of walk through each one, but not going into a lot of detail. I'll let you read the slides. But I'll highlight a few areas where it's a little bit different for healthcare than it is for the broader defense industry, which is where we spend a lot of our time. So for math, science, and general engineering, the biggest thing that we saw was that there were a lot of natural science disciplines and foundations that were less important in some of the other places we had been that became more important in healthcare. Biology, chemistry, physiology. Again, not things that are necessarily surprising, but we started to build the data to really talk about these things. And then for calculus and analytical geometry and computing fundamentals, those things really were not emphasized in the healthcare folks that we talked to. So I want to say again, we're not talking about operational healthcare. We're really talking about medical devices, but those weren't things that came up as being critical within that domain space. In terms of systems domain and operational context, the understanding of the CONOPS was cited as critical everywhere, obviously, which is why it's on this list, but it had one of the strongest emphases in the medical device folks that we talked to. And there were several examples of organizations actually ensuring their systems engineers have time in the operational space to really understand that context, which was unique. You don't send somebody who's working on a missile out to actually stay in the field for a couple of weeks and learn it. So that was interesting and unique and makes sense when you think about how healthcare systems and medical devices would be used. The relevant technologies and relevant disciplines, these are things that we expect to be tailored depending on the organizational context and in the domain that you're working in. We just had a list of those, and I apologize, I don't think I put a slide in on that. And then the system characteristics, the one thing that I would say is safety is critical in a lot of systems, but we heard more about safety critical systems in the healthcare space than we did anywhere else. In terms of the discipline, there was a lot of focus on the life cycle and understanding that. We heard less about things like methods and processes and tools, but again, that's a small sample, so I wouldn't read a whole lot into that. In terms of systems engineering mindset, the big picture thinking and the paradoxical mindset, those were heavily emphasized as being of value when we talked to the folks in healthcare. And not only by the systems engineers themselves, but I think we heard most strongly from their peers, the program managers, the other, mechanical, electrical engineers, that when systems engineers bring that to the table, it fundamentally changes the way that they approach things, particularly when you're talking about not just individual products, but now families of products, or how products that never had to integrate before are now starting to integrate. That is becoming a very critical piece of what systems engineers bring. Again, we heard that other places, but I don't know if it was emphasized as clearly in the defense world as it was in the healthcare systems engineering world. Interpersonal skills, very valuable. Nothing really stood out as being different for healthcare. And then for technical leadership, balanced decision-making and rational risk-taking were really heavily highlighted. And I think part of that is particularly when you're talking about medical devices and all the regulations that you have to deal with. Risk is generally seen as a bad word, but there are appropriate times where you have to take a risk. And so being able to balance that and, again, then tie that with the communication skills to help the business understand that and help the engineering teams understand both sides was really critical. And then, again, talk for a second about families of systems or integrations of systems that you didn't expect would have to integrate, but now in the Internet of Everything kind of days, you have to think about those things. This idea of establishing a major technical strategy and enabling portfolio-level outcomes versus project-level outcomes, those things came across very strongly in healthcare, much more so than in the defense industry. Okay, so those were the skills that enable effectiveness. And what we'll talk through fairly quickly is the different forces that enable those skills. So I mentioned these earlier: experiences, mentoring, education, and training, in that order. So for experiences, we actually went through every single position that each one of our participants had ever been in and looked at all of these different factors for each experience. So the position, which we explained earlier, is kind of whatever your job is as assigned. How relevant it was to systems engineering. So some things like if you, if you worked at a bookstore in college, it might be relevant for learning about punctuality and just general professionalism, but it's not really relevant to systems engineering. chronological time, what the organization you worked in was and some characteristics of that organization. The roles, so we talked about the roles a little bit earlier. What phases of the life cycle you were working on when you were in that position. And if you're working on multiple systems, then you might be touching multiple phases, or you might be following one system through multiple phases. And then the characteristics of the systems themselves that you were working on. And so for each position, we went through and figured that out for everyone to see if we could identify any patterns. So this is just a little bit of data so you can start seeing what folks look like. I mentioned before that all of the healthcare folks that we talked to were really focused on product-centric systems engineering, and you'll see that that is pretty typical for our entire data set. 100% of the people we talked to have worked on products. Much smaller percentages, a little less than a fifth and a little more than a fifth, have worked on services and enterprises respectively. Again, as we hope to move forward to understand healthcare operations and expand our scope for healthcare systems engineering, as this profile on enterprise and services change, I expect that it will change other things that we're seeing. But right now, we just don't have enough data to say much about that. We did come up with a way of identifying the seniority of systems engineers. I don't know if any of you have ever gotten stuck in a conversation that goes something like this. A systems engineer is only a systems engineer if they have at least 20 years of experience, and then someone, maybe you, will say, well, that doesn't really seem right because we have lots of systems engineers who are at different points in their careers, and they just have different scope of work and scope of responsibility, and then you sort of get bogged down in that discussion. That happened to us a lot, and so what we did was we used the empirical data, so things like what you're seeing on slide 22, to come up with what we're seeing as commonalities to identify junior, mid-level, and senior systems engineers. And you can see our sample is pretty heavily senior systems engineers, which, as far as we can tell, reflects the population, but most organizations, to be frank, don't even have this data for their population, so it's kind of hard to tell, but it seems about accurate for all the different organizations we talk to. The reason we don't have classification by years of experience, you can see in this bottom graph, is that there's a lot of overlap. So you might have a very senior person who's just very good at systems engineering and becomes senior quite early in their career, or someone who was, let's say, a mechanical engineer and very good at it, but didn't really start broadening into the systems approach and systems perspective until much later in their career. It doesn't mean that they're not very valuable. It just means in terms of systems engineering, they would be a junior person. That's not to say they would be a junior person at their company. So that's just one way that we thought it was useful to categorize folks and use the data we had on experiences. And this profile of a lot of senior folks, not as many junior and mid-level, but generally more junior than mid-level, was pretty consistent in the healthcare organizations we worked with as well. In terms of mentoring, I won't spend a lot of time on this. We did look at several aspects of mentoring, including how well it's supported within the organization, how people were paired up, what the primary objectives were, et cetera, to understand which mentoring relationships were more effective. We have a lot of information on this. I'm not going to go into it in detail here because it was no different between healthcare organizations and other organizations. Suffice it to say, informal was much more valued than formal, and everybody agreed that it was a good thing, but it was hard to get done with your day job. Those were kind of the take-home message. We did look at the benefits of mentoring. So most organizations think about how it will benefit the mentees, the people receiving mentoring. We also looked at how it helps the people who are doing the mentoring and how it overall can benefit the organization if done successfully. So for the mentees, it's things like you would expect. You might learn more. You might become more effective in your job. You start building a network based on your mentor. For mentors, it was more about sort of the personal feeling that you were passing things on and that you had valuable knowledge to pass on, about maybe training your successor, which makes things like retirement easier. And then for the organization, if done successfully, it really can enable knowledge transfer in a way that you're not going to get in, say, a training course. It helps to fill workforce gaps, and as you're kind of pairing these folks off and grooming successors for the mentors, that increases the overall effectiveness of your workforce. And then finally, education and training. We use the fairly standard definitions. Education is something in pursuit of an academic degree through a college or university program. Training is something that is done sort of independently of that and is usually much shorter and smaller in scope. So nothing magic there. You're just seeing a little bit of information about the education and training demographics of our group. Overall, education and training were both seen as valuable, but not as things that were going to be big game changers in terms of your proficiency. So there's an expectation that systems engineers are going to have a bachelor's degree, for example, and we didn't have a single person in our sample who didn't. You can see in the INCOSE CSEP data, which we analyzed as sort of a validation of our approach, less than 1% of certified CSEPs only had an associate's degree. So it's pretty much easy to say that bachelor's degree is sort of an incoming assumption. Master's degrees are very common, and you'll see again it's about 2/3 that'll have those, or a little under 2/3, and then doctorate degrees were fairly common both in our sample and in the INCOSE data. At the bottom are just some comparison charts between our interviewees and the INCOSE CSEP applicants. The only thing that I would say that's different about healthcare systems engineers is that biomedical engineering at the higher level, when you're looking across the whole sample, really falls into other. It's not very big, but when you move to looking only at the healthcare folks, biomedical engineering as a bachelor's degree becomes much more common, much more prevalent, more along the lines of 1/3 of the population. So in terms of, I suppose, where to look for folks when you need to bring folks in, that seems to be a degree that is very helpful and easy to transition in. And some folks within healthcare organizations said that that was because biomedical engineering, or at least the way it's typically done, is already sort of a multidisciplinary approach. And so that means that you already have some of the skills for systems engineering coming in. Training, obviously each organization is going to do its own training and do it differently. So I don't want to go into a whole lot of this. We looked at what the training subjects were, how it was delivered, how long it was, et cetera. What you see on the left are common subjects, and I've grouped them based on where they fit within our proficiency model. Within healthcare, at least the organizations we talked to, almost no training on the systems domain or the systems engineering discipline. It was expected that you would either have that coming in or you would learn it on the job. So those things were not trained much in healthcare. They're very heavily trained more in the defense industrial base and the DoD. But interpersonal skills and technical leadership training was much more prevalent in healthcare than it was in the defense industrial base. And then some just issues and best practices. The big one is, and again, not surprising, but we have the data on it, so that's nice. If you have people go to training and then have them immediately apply it on their jobs, that actually becomes a permanent change in the person. So you might get a small bump in proficiency based on training, but that bump goes away over time if you don't apply it. If you apply it, it becomes a permanent improvement in proficiency. Access to training is one of those things that's kind of all over the map in every organization, but it was consistently listed as a problem that people knew there was training but couldn't get to it, and that was not different in the healthcare industry. And then there was some talk about looking forward at what risks you can see and using training to address those risks. And some examples were for, say, model-oriented systems engineering. You know that that's a move strategically the company wants to make, so how can you already begin training people before that happens in the corporation? Okay. So we've talked about consistently delivering value by performing the roles and responsibilities assigned, using your skills, and how you might grow those skills. So the next things we'll talk about are what characteristics of an individual and what characteristics of an organization enable effective systems engineering. So the first ones are personal. You'll see on the left-hand side, and those are, again, ranked in order of the importance placed on them by the systems engineers and their peers in the data. So self-awareness was the number one, and I won't read these all to you, but basically individuals who don't possess these skills tend to need a lot more work to grow into systems engineers. It's not impossible, but without these things, it's going to be very difficult. And these things are things that are generally a little bit more difficult to train. So, for example, inquisitiveness, you can be trained on what an inquisitive person looks like, and you can be trained on how to satisfy your curiosity. But the natural asking of why and asking how things fit together and wanting to understand that is much harder to create. So that's just something to say when you're looking for systems engineers to grow or looking to bring in systems engineers, these are things to think of. And again, I don't think any of these are shockers, but we have the data to say why these things are important. This is just some additional detail. You'll have it in the slides. I'm not going to go through each thing. But it talks about, particularly in terms of building proficiencies, where those things become critical. In terms of organizational characteristics, there are kind of two different groups. Well, the first three are things that are characteristics of any organization, whether or not they do systems engineering. But those things are important to understand the overarching context that systems engineer works in. The bottom four are things that are very specific to systems engineering. So there's sort of, the first metric for us became, does the organization even define who a systems engineer is or what systems engineering is? And the answer for a lot of organizations was no, including in the healthcare industry. It's just not something that people at the highest levels of the organization have crisp enough in their minds to be able to call those things out clearly. And that then trickles down, because if you can't define it, how can you appreciate it? How can you reward it? And how can you explain to people how they can actually have a career in it? So those things are important, and they're important for effective systems engineers to have an appreciation of systems engineering, to reward good systems engineering, et cetera. But on balance, most of the organizations that we worked with were not very good at this. There's only one that comes to mind, and it was not a healthcare organization that can do this pretty effectively. Personal initiatives. So these are things that an individual does to help improve their skills in systems engineering that are not just taking advantage of things the organization does. So, for example, the organization might have a training program. Participating in that training program, we don't consider that a personal initiative. These are things that you might do independently. So, again, nothing too surprising here, just in order of the way that they came up. Attending conferences, taking online courses were seen as valuable. Particularly attending conferences is not very supported by most organizations. So individuals who do this are often doing it on their own dime. And that was probably more true in some of the healthcare organizations we worked with than in some of the defense organizations. All DoD organizations require certification. It used to be called SPURDY. I forget what they just changed the acronym to. But outside of the DoD itself, almost no organizations have any requirements for certification. And in fact, in the healthcare organizations we worked with, only one or two individuals were even aware that things like the INCOSE certification existed. So these are things that do happen, but they're pretty uncommon, particularly when you talk about certification. The organization, again, can create some initiatives that are designed to help not just an individual, but the whole workforce overall become more effective. And these are the characteristics of those initiatives. Some things, like I already mentioned, training programs are part of that. Rotational programs are very common, particularly for the junior systems engineers. Degree assistance programs, or even identifying a cohort to, say, pursue a systems engineering master's degree. Those would all be considered organizational development initiatives. And again, in context of Atlas, what we're really talking about is those are just ways to help people grow their proficiency. So that, in a fairly quick nutshell, is what Atlas talks about. And as you get into more detail, you start seeing how some of these things integrate together. The idea being that you would ultimately have someone who is properly aligned in the right position to take advantage of their proficiencies that enable them to deliver value in their organizational context. What we have right now is for an individual systems engineer, and it provides a snapshot in time. So you get one piece of the puzzle. Then what we started to do is take multiple snapshots and then start looking throughout someone's entire career. And what you'll see on the right is the method that we came up with for that. These are not all the variables we tracked, but it's just to make it a little bit easier to read. So for example, you have a proficiency profile at the beginning of your career. That proficiency is going to change over time. It's going to change based on what part of the life cycle you worked on, what roles you've played, what types of systems you've worked on, and where you were in your career. We also track things like career milestones. That might be the first time you became a systems engineer or had a real systems engineering job. It might be things like becoming a chief systems engineer, as well as educational milestones. And what we've done is then lay that out over time to really get a sense of how someone got to where they are today. And then you can extrapolate looking at where they might go in the future, and use the data on what they've done to get where they are today to figure out what they might need to do to grow in the future. So that's just a bigger view of the career path approach. And again, what we'd like to see people doing, and we've helped a couple organizations do this, and we're starting on a very large pilot in another organization in the next couple of weeks, is taking all of this insight into how everything you've done has helped you to get to where you are today in systems engineering. So let's say that's this line on the bottom here, the solid line, and then thinking about what systems engineers need to do in your organization, maybe in a role with more responsibility, or maybe even just as the organization grows in scope, think about where you need to go and then use, again, the data to back up your experiences, your mentoring, your education and training, and design a path to get there. So that is what we're really hoping Atlas will do. Some organizations, again, have started on this. So far, that hasn't been unique to healthcare organizations, but I think if we can get into some healthcare operation and delivery folks, I think that the patterns that we see will be different. So we talked about the values. These are just a few things that came up loud and clear in the healthcare space. Again, you'll see things like strong understanding of customer needs, of the systems and the domain context, ability to make decisions at the systems level. Those are not uncommon. They're not different than the DoD, but these are just the things that came out most strongly in the healthcare group. Systems engineering was seen in the healthcare organizations that we went to as tending to be very focused on products and process. And where that was the case, it was generally not valued. However, when the focus was on the things like understanding customer value, helping make broad-scale decisions, then when that happens, systems engineering and systems thinking were valued. And systems thinking, whether it's by a systems engineer or someone else, was very commonly appreciated in the healthcare sector. In terms of career planning, that was a little bit more unclear in the healthcare sector, but again, I think it's because when you don't define what a systems engineer is, that's hard to do. And I think we mentioned biomedical engineering is a common access point in the healthcare industry for products, healthcare systems engineers. So we're looking to, as we go forward, get more healthcare folks involved. We want people who can help us with operation and delivery and focus on service instead of just medical devices. We're hoping that maybe we could talk to some folks in public health and pharmaceuticals, and there it would be more on being a systems thinker than a systems engineer, but we think that there's some useful understanding and overlap with that. And then all of our healthcare participants to date have been in industry, and so we're hoping to incorporate some folks that would be on the government side as well. Long term, we'd like to create a tailored version of Atlas that would be tailored to healthcare systems engineering. And this is not specific to healthcare, but what we would like to do is, right now what we have is focused on an individual systems engineer being effective. And obviously you can say, I have 10 systems engineers and here's how effective the 10 of them are. But we anticipate that there's some synergy where the whole is going to be greater than the sum of its parts when you're looking at teams and organizations. And so we're going to do some modeling and additional data collection to help this scale. So that is what I had packaged to present today. If you're interested in the project or just have questions that you don't want to voice here today, there's my contact information. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bob and Ammon, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that. We have a few minutes for questions. We have one question that's asking about the sample size of the healthcare systems engineers in your study.
Okay. So the healthcare systems engineers in our study were 10% of our sample. So we had 287, so it was probably 29. I would have to look it up. So it's not a huge number of people. That was from 2 different organizations. But it is enough that we could start seeing a few differences between healthcare and DoD, but that's why I have tried not to overemphasize those results, because it is, in the end, only about 29 people.
You know, you had talked that most of those came from device companies. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So we have not been able to get into a more service-oriented organization at this point. So yeah, it has been on organizations that focus on medical device development.
Have you thought about reaching out to the American College of Clinical Engineering to try to connect to people with a systems engineering type of background, only on the healthcare delivery side?
That's a very good suggestion. We have been working on getting into a couple of organizations, and again, I can't outline which specific ones until we have an agreement and they say that it's okay that we talk about them. But that's a good suggestion, and we had not looked at the American College of Clinical Engineering, so I will take a note on that. And if you have someone you'd recommend we talk to, that would be great. Okay,
I can send you a few names. I'm don't know these people well, but I'm happy to share, contacts. There also was a question about within the medical device companies, were these organizations that made large-scale products, small individual products, supplies?
So we've worked with 2 healthcare organizations. So 2 of the 20 organizations that we've worked with were healthcare. And both of them did a broad scale. So things like CT and X-ray and MRI down to insulin pumps and heart monitors and a broad scale of different types of devices. I can't share a whole lot more than that without.
No, I understand. I've been through some of these surveys too, that where you have to make sure it's all non-attributed. But no, I was curious about that because you had mentioned that there seemed to be a greater emphasis within the healthcare organizations on having the person understand the operational context, understand the concept of operations, maybe actually go spend some time with, quote unquote, in the field, and trying to understand how that fits within the scope of the devices they're building.
Yes, and that was a theme, again, that we heard consistently in those two organizations that we didn't hear when we were talking to some of the DOD, building missiles, building tanks kind of folks. I mean, you just don't put a civilian out in the tank and say, go hang out for a week. But with the medical devices, they actually want to understand what's the context, how are they being used, even the workflows for when those things become part of patient care, et cetera. And so that was an interesting and different thing, again, on the two organizations that we worked with.
And do you think the increasing prominence of electronic health records and capturing everything in an electronic health record, that's part of that trend that's forcing people to get out there and look at what else is going on?
I think that may be a part of it, but I feel that it's ancillary. I think most of the systems engineers in healthcare that we talked to were really thinking about, maybe it's integrated. What they were thinking is they had, devices that they had developed over time, that they're continuing to come up with new models and things, that had never had to talk to each other before. There was no expectation 10 years ago that this device could talk to that device and could have information from this one. And now when you're thinking about kind of that Internet of Things where there's expected integration and connectivity, they're having to take that broader view and really understand that concept. So in terms of, I don't know if it's specific to the electronic health records, but I think that expected integration then would expect you to have a better health record. So it might all go together.
Okay, so you saw more evidence of just integration at the patient bedside. You're being monitored by 3 or 4 different things, and that's driving what you do with other devices. Okay, that's an interesting observation.
We did. And I'm looking at the questions. I see profiles of non-device SEs like delivery. And so we just don't have any of those folks in our sample. We're working on it and hoping to get some. And I see a comment, integration with patient care. Yeah. And so that's, when we're talking about the heavy emphasis on operations, I think that's a good way of putting it. Understanding how these things really get used in patient care and understanding how all that fits together. So for one example, give me a second because I'm going to try and say it in a way that doesn't identify which company I'm talking about. When a doctor chooses to use a certain device, and the workflow associated with that might actually cause some failures that you wouldn't expect. I'm being very vague, and I'm sorry because I can't share certain things. Trying to think if I can give an example that doesn't identify the company. I apologize, I'm sure. But it's basically that larger context. And when is a doctor going to use this? Is it the nurse who's going to apply it? Is it a technician? Who's going to read the results? How does all that fit together? Not just does the thing work. That was different about healthcare, and it was actually exciting to hear the way people were thinking about approaching those problems. And you used the term in the field, Bob, and I would say that's exactly it. They've actually sent some systems engineers to spend field time not only observing how these things are getting used, but also what's causing breakage. Because sometimes it's not a technical thing, it's a process thing, or it's a workflow thing. And understanding all of that to reduce failures was a really interesting approach that I appreciated.
Yeah, we're seeing that on the, we run the healthcare MBSE challenge team, and one part of the team has been, looking at the clinical environment. We've interviewed several emergency room nurses and talked to them about, okay, how do they use this particular device? What are the steps they go through? And then trying to capture that with systems engineering tools. And you very quickly see that some of these devices, there are some significant disconnects, things that in the DoD world I would have called swivel chair integration, where the person is looking at one display, reading numbers, and then he twists his chair to another display and starts typing those same numbers in. And, the accuracy is only as good as his memory and whether he doesn't get distracted while he's doing, swiveling back and forth. There are a number of those kinds of things in the process that, become opportunities for failures or errors. And so, getting into the clinical process is very important, and it will vary with each individual device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very accurate. It would be interesting to see how some of the things or some of the findings from the NBSA challenge are shared, because I said that almost none of the folks in healthcare, maybe 10%, probably not even that many, had even heard, knew that you could get an INCOSE certification. But actually, most of them had never even heard of INCOSE. So within DoD, people have at least heard of it. They may not know much about it, but it's a thing that's out there. Most of the folks we talked to in healthcare systems engineering didn't even know this thing called INCOSE existed. So it'd be interesting to see how findings like that, which are very relevant to what people are worrying about, could be shared maybe a little more broadly.
Yep. The working group's trying to take that on, and we certainly recognize we've got a challenge with reaching out and connecting to a broad population that exists, but that isn't aware that INCOSE exists.
Right.
Okay, we've run a few minutes over, so yes?
I said sorry about that.
Okay, so thank you again for an excellent presentation, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you out at the International Workshop. Thank you to everybody.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me.
And we'll be getting the slides out to you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.